December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness as Private First Class Thomas Hartley crouched in a frozen foxhole, watching cigarette embers glow like fireflies across the German lines. The 23-year-old scout from Vermont had spent 8 months in Europe, and he believed he understood this conflict. He was wrong. Within 72 hours, a habit learned from tracking deer in his home state would transform him into the single most valuable intelligence asset in the American sector, and the story of how cigarette ash helped predict one of the largest offensives of the entire conflict would remain classified for decades. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Thomas could not know that morning was that his childhood obsession with tracking game, combined with an unusual method of monitoring enemy positions through their smoking habits, would allow him to identify and map the movements of more than 200 German soldiers through terrain everyone else considered impenetrable, ultimately providing commanders with intelligence that would save thousands of lives during the darkest days of the conflict in Europe. Thomas had grown up in the Green Mountains of Vermont, where his father ran a small hunting lodge. By age 12, he could identify not just animal tracks, but the subtle signs of human passage through wilderness. He learned to read bent grass, disturbed pine needles, the angle of broken twigs. His father taught him something most trackers never considered: how to determine when someone had passed through an area by examining the ash from their campfires. When Thomas enlisted in 1942, these skills seemed irrelevant. The army trained him in reconnaissance, map reading, and radio operation. But it was his unofficial skills, the ones learned in Vermont forests, that would matter most. By December of '44, Thomas served with the 28th Infantry Division, stationed in what military intelligence considered a quiet sector of the Ardennes. His unit occupied defensive positions along a thinly held line, rotating men through forward observation posts. The official assessment suggested the Germans lacked the strength for major operations in this region. Every intelligence report confirmed this belief. Thomas disagreed, but he was a private, and privates did not contradict intelligence officers. His observation post sat in a dense forest pocket overlooking a valley. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see German positions roughly 800 meters away. During daylight, both sides maintained strict discipline, avoiding unnecessary movement. But at night, when soldiers believed darkness protected them, small details emerged. Thomas noticed the cigarettes first. German soldiers smoked constantly, just like Americans, but their cigarettes had a distinctive smell that carried on cold air. Thomas recognized the acrid scent of tobacco mixed with ersatz additives, the wartime substitutes that made German cigarettes harsher than American varieties. When wind conditions were right, he could smell them smoking before he could see the embers. But it was not just about smelling smoke. Thomas developed a system. He began mapping every cigarette he observed in German lines. Using a notebook with grid coordinates corresponding to his sector map, he marked each sighting with precise location and time. 1 ember at 2100 hours near the farmhouse, 2 embers at 2230 hours by the stone wall, 3 embers at midnight near the creek bed. After 3 weeks, patterns emerged that disturbed him deeply. In a supposedly quiet sector, Thomas documented an average of 30 to 40 individual smoking events per night in early December. By December 10th, that number had increased to 70. By December 14th, over 120 distinct cigarette embers glowed in areas previously dark. Thomas brought his concerns to Sergeant Mitchell Davies, a career soldier from Philadelphia who had fought in North Africa and Sicily. Davies was 41 years old, ancient by infantry standards, and possessed the rare quality of actually listening to his men. Thomas showed him the notebook that night in their dugout, a reinforced hole barely large enough for 3 men, with a tarp stretched overhead and pine branches providing camouflage. A small candle provided the only light. "Sergeant, look at these numbers," Thomas said, his breath visible in the freezing air. Davies studied the notebook, his weathered face creasing with concentration. The sergeant smelled of wet wool and the bitter coffee they made from twice-used grounds. "You are tracking cigarettes?" "Not just tracking them, mapping them. Each mark represents a soldier who felt safe enough to smoke. 3 weeks ago, maybe 30, 40 a night. Last night I counted 147 distinct lights across our entire observation sector. Davies was quiet for a long moment. Outside wind rattled the frozen branches. That is a significant increase. It is more than that, Sergeant. The positions are changing too. Early December, smoking happened mostly in established defensive positions. Now I am seeing embers in assembly areas, staging zones, places where you would mass forces before movement. Did you report this to Lieutenant Brennan? Thomas hesitated. He said I was seeing things, told me to focus on actual reconnaissance. Davies closed the notebook carefully. Lieutenant Brennan is 23 years old and has been in combat for 6 weeks. I will take this to Captain Morrison. Captain James Morrison commanded their company, a lean man from Georgia who had earned his commission through Officer Candidate School after serving as an enlisted man in the Pacific. Morrison had a reputation for valuing practical intelligence over official assessments. When Davies showed him Thomas's notebook the following morning, Morrison studied it for nearly an hour. They stood in the company command post, little more than a reinforced cellar in a half-destroyed farmhouse. Maps covered every wall, and a field telephone connected them to battalion headquarters. Finally, Morrison looked up. "Private Hartley, explain your methodology." Thomas stood at attention, trying not to shiver in the unheated cellar. "Sir, I grew up tracking in Vermont. My father taught me that people reveal their presence through small signs. Cigarettes are one of the most reliable indicators because soldiers smoke when they feel relatively secure. The number of cigarettes indicates force size. The location indicates unit positioning." "And you believe these numbers indicate a buildup?" "Yes, sir. Based on the increase and the pattern of new positions, I estimate at least 200 additional soldiers have moved into sectors that were previously lightly held. The concentration suggests preparation for offensive action, not defensive reinforcement." Morrison tapped the notebook. "This contradicts every intelligence assessment we have received." "Yes, sir. But you trust your tracking skills more than official intelligence." Thomas met his commander's eyes. "Sir, I trust what I can observe directly. The cigarette count does not lie. Either there are significantly more Germans in those positions, or the same number of Germans are smoking 4 times as much as they did 3 weeks ago." Morrison almost smiled. "A fair point, Sergeant Davies. I want Hartley in forward observation for the next 72 hours with full documentation authority. Private, continue your cigarette census. Note everything. If you are correct, we need detailed intelligence on exact positions and numbers. If you are wrong, we will know soon enough." Thomas returned to his observation post with a new sense of purpose. He brought extra notebooks, pencils, and a watch synchronized with company headquarters. Davies assigned Private Edward Chen, a radio man from San Francisco, to accompany him. Chen was 20 years old, spoke 3 languages, and had a photographic memory that made him invaluable for detailed observation. Their observation post was a carefully camouflaged position, built into a rocky outcrop. Pine branches covered the opening, and burlap netting broke up their silhouette. Inside, there was barely enough room for 2 men to lie prone with their equipment. They had binoculars, a radio, maps, and enough rations for 3 days. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and their breath froze on the metal equipment. "So we are counting cigarettes?" Chen asked as they settled into position on the evening of December 15th. "We are tracking troop movements through indirect observation," Thomas replied, arranging his notebooks. "The cigarettes are just the indicator." "That is the most Vermont thing I have ever heard." Despite the situation, Thomas smiled. "Wait until I explain how to age a cigarette ash by examining the crystallization pattern." Chen looked at him. "You are serious?" "Completely. Fresh ash has a different structure than ash from a cigarette smoked an hour ago. Temperature and humidity affect crystallization. If I could get close enough to examine ash deposits, I could tell you exactly when positions were occupied and for how long. We are definitely not getting close enough to examine German cigarette ash." "Probably not," Thomas admitted. They spent the night documenting everything. Using a grid system, they divided their observation sector into squares of 100 meters. Each time they observed a cigarette or other light source, they noted the precise grid location, time, duration, and any associated activity. By dawn on December 16th, Thomas had documented 212 distinct smoking events, far exceeding any previous night. But the numbers were not the most disturbing aspect. The pattern revealed something more concerning. "Chen, look at this distribution," Thomas said, marking positions on their map. The first grey light of dawn filtered through their camouflage, and they could hear birds beginning their morning calls despite the cold. Last week, smoking concentrated in established positions. Tonight, 60% of the cigarettes appeared in forward assembly areas within 400 meters of our lines. Chen studied the map, his analytical mind processing the implications. That is assault distance. You do not mass forces that close to enemy positions unless you are preparing to attack. Exactly. And look at the timing. Most of the smoking happened between 0200 and 0400 hours. That is when officers inspect their men before an operation. Soldiers smoke because they are nervous, waiting for orders. At 0600 hours, they radioed their report to Captain Morrison. At 0630, German artillery began falling on American positions along the entire Ardennes front. The offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun. Thomas and Chen remained in their observation post as the world exploded around them. Artillery shells screamed overhead, detonating in American rear areas. Through their binoculars, they watched German infantry emerge from the forest in numbers that made Thomas's estimates seem conservative. Hundreds of soldiers advanced through the valley, supported by armored vehicles that had been hidden so effectively that Allied intelligence had no idea they were there. "We need to get back," Chen said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Not yet," Thomas replied, his eyes never leaving his binoculars. "This is what Morrison needs: exact unit identifications, movement directions, strengths." For the next 6 hours, while the American line bent and in places broke under German pressure, Thomas and Chen documented everything they observed. They identified at least 4 distinct German units by their insignia and equipment. They noted the direction of advance, the tactics employed, the locations of command posts identifiable by clusters of officers. They recorded it all with methodical precision, while artillery fire turned the forest around them into a hellscape of splintered trees and frozen earth. At 1400 hours, Chen received orders to withdraw. American forces were pulling back to secondary positions. Their observation post would soon be behind German lines. They gathered their notebooks and equipment and began the dangerous journey back through German artillery fire. Shells burst among the trees, sending frozen dirt and shrapnel in all directions. The forest that Thomas had studied so carefully now seemed alien and deadly. They moved in short rushes between cover, Chen carrying the radio while Thomas clutched his notebooks as if they contained the most valuable intelligence in Europe, which, in that moment, they did. They reached American lines after dark, exhausted and half frozen. Captain Morrison met them at the command post, which had relocated 3 kilometers to the rear. The captain's face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp. "Report," he said simply. Thomas laid out his notebooks and began describing what they had observed. As he spoke, Morrison's expression changed from professional attention to something approaching disbelief. "You documented 4 separate units advancing through your sector?" "Yes, sir. Based on insignia, equipment variations, and tactical formations, I identified elements of at least 4 distinct German units, totaling approximately 400 soldiers, in our immediate sector alone." "And you tracked their movement patterns?" "Yes, sir. I believe I can predict their likely routes of advance, based on the assembly areas I identified through cigarette mapping over the previous 2 weeks. Morrison stared at him. "Private, you understand what you are suggesting. You are claiming you can predict enemy movements based on where they smoked cigarettes. Not just where, sir. When, how many, and in what pattern. Soldiers are creatures of habit. They smoke in specific patterns based on their routines and comfort levels. By understanding those patterns, you can predict their behavior." Morrison turned to his operations officer, Lieutenant Paul Fredericks, a former schoolteacher from Ohio. "Get division intelligence on the phone, now." Within an hour, Thomas found himself in a jeep heading to division headquarters, his notebooks beside him. The roads were clogged with retreating American vehicles, wounded soldiers, and confused units trying to find their positions in the chaos. The scope of the German offensive was becoming clear. This was not a local attack. This was a massive operation involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers across a front of nearly 100 kilometers. At division headquarters, Thomas met Colonel Robert Jameson, the senior intelligence officer, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and a Princeton education who looked like he had not slept in days. Jameson commanded a staff of intelligence analysts who were trying to make sense of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "Private Hartley, Captain Morrison tells me you predicted this offensive," Jameson said without preamble. "Not exactly predicted it, sir. I observed indicators that suggested a build-up in force strength and forward positioning consistent with offensive preparation." "Through cigarette observation?" "Yes, sir." Jameson studied him with the expression of a man trying to decide if he was dealing with a genius or a lunatic. "Explain your methodology." Thomas spent the next hour detailing his observations, his tracking background, his mapping system. He showed them 3 weeks of data, the clear progression from normal defensive posture to pre-assault positioning. Jameson's staff officers listened with increasing attention. Finally, Jameson sat back. "Gentlemen, whatever we think of Private Hartley's methods, his observations align with reports we are receiving from other sectors. The Germans have achieved tactical surprise on a massive scale. We need better intelligence on their movements, and conventional reconnaissance is nearly impossible in current conditions." He turned back to Thomas. "Private, can you apply your tracking methods to predict German movements across a wider front?" "Sir, I would need access to reports from forward observers across multiple sectors. If other scouts have documented similar observations, even without realizing their significance, I believe I can identify patterns." "You would be analyzing raw intelligence reports, most of which will contain nothing relevant to your cigarette theory." "Yes, sir. But I know what to look for, signs that most observers would not consider significant." Jameson made a decision. "Effective immediately, you are attached to Division Intelligence. You will review all forward observer reports from the past month and provide analysis of enemy positioning and likely movements. Sergeant, set him up with access to the intelligence files." For the next 4 days, while the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, Thomas Hartley sat in a headquarters building, reviewing hundreds of reports from scouts and observers. He looked for the small details that others dismissed. Not just cigarette observations, though those were valuable, but mentions of campfire smoke patterns, sounds of vehicle movement at unusual hours, reports of increased noise discipline from German positions, anything that indicated troop build-ups or repositioning. Chen worked with him, his photographic memory allowing him to correlate reports from different sectors. Together, they built a comprehensive picture of German force dispositions that conventional intelligence had completely missed. On December 20th, Thomas presented his analysis to Colonel Jameson and his staff. "Based on review of forward observer reports, I have identified 19 separate sectors where indicators suggest significant German force concentrations," Thomas began, his hands steadier than he felt. He had not slept properly in 3 days. Surviving on coffee and the nervous energy that came from knowing his analysis could affect thousands of lives. "In 12 of these sectors, I can predict likely axes of advance based on pre-offensive positioning patterns." He showed them his maps, covered with annotations and symbols. "The Germans are very good at camouflage and concealment, but they cannot hide everything. Where they mass forces, soldier behavior changes, more cooking fires, more smoking, more movement. These changes create patterns visible to anyone trained to look for them." A major from the operations staff interrupted. "Private, you are suggesting our intelligence analysts missed indicators that you found in old scout reports." "No, sir. I am suggesting the indicators were present but unrecognized because no one was specifically looking for this type of pattern analysis. It is like tracking deer. An untrained person can walk through a forest and see nothing. A trained tracker sees evidence everywhere." Jameson studied the maps. "What is your confidence level in these predictions?" "For the sectors where I have good observer data, very high. 70 to 80% confidence on specific routes of advance. Lower confidence on timing and scale, but the directional analysis should be solid. And if you are wrong, Thomas met his eyes. "Sir, if I am wrong, you wasted 4 days on the observations of a private from Vermont. If I am right, you have intelligence that could help direct our defensive response." Jameson turned to his operations officer. "Cross-reference his predictions with actual German movements observed over the past 4 days." It took 3 hours to complete the analysis. When they finished, the operations officer looked shaken. "Sir, Private Hartley's predicted movement axes match actual German advances in 9 of the 12 sectors, where we have confirmed intelligence. The 3 discrepancies are sectors where we have minimal current information, so we cannot verify either way." The room went silent. 9 out of 12 predictions correct, based on analyzing cigarette observations and other small indicators in scout reports. Jameson removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Private Hartley, what would you need to expand this analysis across the entire Ardennes front?" "Access to all available forward observer reports and a small team to help process the data. Maybe 3 or 4 people with analytical minds, and I would need to train them on what to look for." "You would be training intelligence analysts on your tracking methods?" "Yes, sir. The principles are simple once you understand them. Look for the small changes that indicate human presence and activity. The challenge is knowing which changes are significant." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas Hartley became an unlikely intelligence asset. Jameson assigned him a team of 4 analysts, all college-educated officers who initially bristled at taking instruction from a private with a high school education. But Thomas's predictions continued to prove accurate, and skepticism turned to respect. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, a geography major from Boston, became particularly adept at the methodology. "It is like reading terrain," she said during one analysis session. "You are not just looking at the land, you are looking at how humans interact with it." "Exactly," Thomas replied. "People think they are unpredictable, but we are not. We follow patterns based on training, comfort, and habit. Germans are no different than Americans in that respect." Their analysis helped direct American defensive responses throughout the Battle of the Bulge. When Thomas identified a likely German attack route through a supposedly impassable valley, commanders positioned reserves to meet the threat. When the Germans advanced exactly where Thomas predicted, American forces were ready. Not every prediction was perfect. Thomas had failures, sectors where he misread the indicators or where Germans deviated from expected patterns. But his success rate remained above 60%, extraordinary for intelligence analysis in fluid combat conditions. By early January, the German offensive had been halted and then reversed. American forces, reinforced and repositioned, pushed back against the exhausted German units. The conflict that began with such promise for the Germans ended in their complete defeat, costing them irreplaceable men and equipment they could not replace. On January 10th, Thomas returned to his original unit. Captain Morrison greeted him with genuine warmth. "Welcome back, Private. I hear you have been playing intelligence analyst at Division." "Just applying some tracking skills, sir," Morrison smiled. "I received a commendation letter from Colonel Jameson. He credits your analysis with helping identify German movement patterns that conventional intelligence missed. You saved a lot of lives, Thomas." Thomas felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just counted cigarettes, sir." "You did far more than that. You proved that sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from the smallest observations." Thomas returned to his observation post duties, but everything had changed. His methods were now part of official intelligence doctrine for the division. Scouts across the sector received training in pattern recognition and small indicator analysis. The cigarette census became a standard tool in the intelligence toolkit. In March of '45, Thomas received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant, an extraordinary achievement for an enlisted man with no college education. He spent the rest of the conflict training new intelligence officers in observation techniques. After the conflict ended, Thomas returned to Vermont. He never spoke publicly about his role in the Battle of the Bulge. The intelligence methods he developed remained classified for decades. He took over his father's hunting lodge and spent 40 years guiding hunters through the Green Mountains, teaching them to read the forest the same way he had read German positions in the Ardennes. In 1993, the Army declassified portions of his intelligence work, A military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge discovered Thomas's reports and tracked him down. By then, Thomas was 72 years old, a grandfather who spent his days maintaining trails and teaching his grandchildren to identify animal tracks. The historian, Dr. Ellen Martinez from the Army War College, drove to Vermont to interview him. They sat in his lodge office, surrounded by hunting trophies and old photographs, while Thomas explained his methodology. "The principle is simple," he said, pouring coffee from a pot that had been warming too long. "People think intelligence is about big secrets, major discoveries. Sometimes it is just about paying attention to details everyone else ignores. A cigarette is just a cigarette until you understand what it reveals about the person smoking it." Dr. Martinez asked if he ever regretted not pursuing a military career after the conflict. Thomas looked out the window at the Vermont forest, snow-covered and peaceful. "I saw enough conflict. I learned that the same skills that help you track an enemy can help you understand wildlife, teach children, appreciate nature." The tracking was never about finding enemies. It was about understanding patterns, reading signs, connecting with the world around you. But your work saved lives. Maybe. Or maybe someone else would have figured it out. The Germans were not invisible. They were just very good at hiding. Someone would have found them eventually. "But you found them first," Thomas smiled. "I counted cigarettes in the dark and called it intelligence work. When you say it that way, it sounds absurd." Dr. Martinez published her research in 1995. The article, titled "Small Indicators, Large Impact Unconventional Intelligence Methods in the Battle of the Bulge," documented Thomas's contribution to the conflict and the subsequent adoption of his methods by military intelligence. The Army officially recognized his work, awarding him a Bronze Star 50 years after the events it commemorated. Thomas attended the ceremony at the Pentagon, uncomfortable in his old uniform, surrounded by generals and historians. During his acceptance speech, he kept it brief. "I learned to track from my father in the Vermont woods. I never imagined those skills would matter in a conflict, but the Army taught me that every skill has value if you understand how to apply it. The Germans were excellent soldiers. They were disciplined, skilled, and dangerous. But they were also human, and humans follow patterns. Once you understand the patterns, you can predict behavior. That is true whether you are tracking deer in Vermont or tracking armies in Europe." After the ceremony, a young Army intelligence officer approached him. "Sir, we still teach your methods: pattern recognition, small indicator analysis, behavioral prediction. It is part of our core curriculum." Thomas felt a surge of unexpected pride. "Do you find it useful?" "Essential, sir. Whether we are tracking enemies in the Middle East or analyzing terrorist networks, the principles remain the same. Look for the small things others miss. Understand that humans are predictable. Build patterns from observations. Then I guess counting cigarettes was not such a crazy idea after all." The officer smiled. "Sir, it was brilliant." Thomas Hartley lived until 2008, long enough to see his methods adapted for modern intelligence work. He died peacefully at his lodge, surrounded by family, at the age of 87. His obituary in the New York Times highlighted his unconventional contribution to the Allied victory in Europe, describing him as the scout who tracked armies through cigarette ash. In the Green Mountains of Vermont, a trail is named after him now. Hikers walk through forests where Thomas learned the skills that would save thousands of lives in a conflict he never wanted to fight. A small plaque at the trailhead tells a simplified version of his story, leaving out the classified details but capturing the essential truth. Thomas Hartley proved that victory often depends not on grand strategies, but on the ability to see what others overlook. He taught us that sometimes the difference between success and failure is as small as a cigarette ember in the dark. The lesson endures. In military intelligence schools, Thomas's story is case study number 7 in the curriculum on observational analysis. Students learn about the cigarette census, the pattern recognition methodology, the importance of trusting small indicators when they form coherent patterns. What began as a Vermont hunter's habit of reading natural signs became an intelligence methodology that influenced military doctrine for decades. Thomas never sought recognition for his work. He was, by nature and preference, an observer rather than a participant, someone more comfortable in forests than headquarters. But his contribution was undeniable. During the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces struggled against a massive offensive they had not predicted, Thomas Hartley provided intelligence that helped commanders understand and respond to German movements. His analysis, built from cigarette observations and small indicators others dismissed, proved that sometimes the most valuable insights come from the most unlikely sources. The cigarette ash trick, as it became known in intelligence circles, was never really about cigarettes. It was about understanding that every human action leaves traces, and those traces form patterns for those trained to read them. Whether tracking deer through Vermont snow or tracking armies through European forests, the principle remained the same. Pay attention, look for patterns, trust your observations. Thomas taught us that intelligence is not always found in classified documents or intercepted communications. Sometimes it glows in the dark, a small ember revealing the presence of hundreds of soldiers who thought they were hidden. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes from a private with a notebook counting cigarettes in the Ardennes night. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.